Okay, so welcome back to another lecture on Marx, or the second half of my lecture on Marx. So we're going to go further today. I hope you're good and feeling alienated and you're disturbed and you really want to find a solution to this problem that capitalist society has put you into. At this point, we need to say something about Alienation, which was not a very good movie, or was it a show? I think this was a movie and then there was a show afterwards. We don't actually need to say anything about Alienation because what I'd like to talk about is alienation. So Marx develops the idea of alienation to talk about how people are discomforted, especially the proletariat, but actually everybody in capitalist society and in feudal society before that to a different extent, is separated from the way that they're supposed to be living. They are alienated, which does go along with, so that's an actual alien, but here you become alien to a set of things. You become separated from. There become gaps between you and these things which are properly integrated with you. So what does Marx mean by alienation, and how does this eventually shape the development of material relations? Well, Marx develops 4 different kinds of alienation. The first one is alienation from the objects of production. In order to understand this, let's go back to that natural state of people, back in primitive communism, where people are expressive, creative people. And so they create a particular thing, and they invest themselves in that thing, and they're proud of that thing. That thing represents them. And so they can always look at that thing. Even if somebody else is wearing the shoe, they take pride in the shoe that has been made, and they say, I made that. And so they're able to gain some fulfillment from this. But Marx looks around at industrial society and he says, you know what's happened is we don't even make things anymore. So we can take the example of Ford and the development of the production line. Once we get the production line going, the production line is actually what produces the car. But what do individuals produce? I mean, the car rolls up, your job is to screw in this nut on the wheel, and then the car goes on, and somebody else screws in their nut someplace else in the car. Or your job is to guide the engine into the body of the car. And what is this? Are you proud? Are you proud of the engine and how it sits in the car? I mean, that seems strange. So participating in this labor, you're putting yourself out there in your labor, but your labor is just kind of floating away from you. You no longer have control or pride in the object that you create, and this leads to a kind of emptiness within you as you are unable to find fulfillment through your labor in this society. Second, and following from this, is alienation from the act of labor. So in our natural state, we put ourselves into those products and we actually enjoyed making them. The art of making them, the practice of making them, was something that we found fulfillment in. And at the end of the day, we could think, you know what, I've achieved something today. But as we move into capitalist forms of labor, we no longer own our own labor. It's not ours. It's floated away down the line someplace. And so our labor is not our own act. Furthermore, our labor is not even really voluntary, because all labor in the capitalist system is basically forced labor. Now, we could look around and go back to Locke and we could say, oh no, this isn't the case. We have natural rights and nobody's supposed to force us around. But Locke didn't note that you could be forced to do things by economic forces. Locke and most of the liberal tradition has been focused on the dangers of authoritarian government, those nobles and those kings who are going to come and take away your rights. But Marx recognizes that actually economic systems force you to do things as well. Like, what if you decided not to work? What option do you really have? Don't you have to work in order to have like food and the goods that sustain you? And doesn't that mean that when you go into work, your time, your labor, the active labor that you do actually belongs to somebody else? Here we can link this up with Marx's theory of value, because although you're putting a certain amount of labor value out there, you're not actually claiming all of the labor value associated with your labor. You're only getting back a certain portion of that. Have you ever heard living for the weekend? Well, why do you live for the weekend? Why don't you live to go to work? Maybe it's because you realize that the weekend is your time, as opposed to the rest of your time, which is actually owned by somebody else. This is the kind of thing that Marx was thinking about when he thought about alienation from the act of labor. That the act of labor, which could be fulfilling, ceases to be fulfilling because the act of labor is actually stolen from you by the bourgeoisie. Third, Marx talks about alienation from species identity, which is hard to say, so I'm just going to say human nature. So go back to human nature again and say, okay, so as human beings, we're actually creative, expressive selves, beings that want to be able to pursue our own projects and see the fulfillment of our own projects. But when we lose ourselves to the market economy, we're no longer able to pursue what we want to do. We are given jobs by the system that we're in. So while the liberal system was supposed to give us autonomy and self-control, it's actually produced another set of systems that function to take away our own power and take away our own ability to do our own creative projects. Unfortunately, says Marx, the liberal tradition up to this point has been structured in such a way that you can't really see it. You'll feel it, because you'll realize how unfulfilling your work is day to day, but you won't be able to name it if all you have is the natural rights tradition that came before me. Finally, fourth, we'll be alienated from others. We'll be alienated from other people. How does this happen? Well, in our natural state, we all shared different things, and we were all able to have authentic relationships with each other. So I, in fact, was not bound to give you something because it was the rules of my society. I saw that you were in need. I saw your suffering. But what happens as we get into a capitalist society is that we cease to have authentic relationships with each other, and we start to see each other simply as economic units. I start to see other people in terms of being customers rather than being people, being opportunities to make money on, trying to analyze them in that most bourgeois of ways, trying to calculate out what are the advantages and disadvantages of these particular relationships, and what do they gain me. Now, you might think, no, this doesn't affect me at all. It's not the case, but actually, we think in these terms just about constantly in our society. So, again, I think I've raised this example before. People can talk about social capital. Well, what's your social capital? All of the personality traits that you have that make you more social, more outgoing, more palatable to other people, and all of your relationships to other people that are supportive of you. Well, these are all parts of social capital. Well, what's happening here is we're talking about relationships as if they were commodities, as if they were products as a part of an exchange. But this is a typical way of talking in contemporary social science. It reflects the capitalist form of material relations in which we exist. But if this doesn't impress you, we can talk about some more mundane examples. Imagine you invite your friends over to help you move at some point, or you invite one of your friends to watch your cat while you're out of town. Well, at that point, do you feel obligated to do something for those people who come over and help? And if so, why? So, like, when you're offering for your friends to come over and do something for you, do you feel like you need to say, oh, and in exchange, I'll get you pizza? Or, if the person is watching your cat, do you feel like, oh, you ought to get them, like, a gift card in order to pay them off for this? Do you offer them something in exchange for their labor? Well, why do you do this? Can't we just be friends with people and have exchanges of goods that aren't tied into a capitalist economy? Or is this simply part of the structure of our reality so that if people came and gave their labor, they would automatically assume that they ought to get something out of it, some material product that they could claim at the end of the process? At Christmas, do you feel that it's necessary to calculate the amount that you spend on presents so that you give equal amounts across? Because as a matter of fact, it would be unfair to exchange unequal things. Well, that's because it's actually a mode of exchange. It's not a gift at all. These are all the ways that we tend to come to think in terms of the capitalist economy and imagine other people not in authentic relationships with ourselves, but as other economic units working their way around the society. Okay, so we ought to talk about some of the ideology of capitalist society and how capitalist society actually kind of distracts you from those feelings of alienation because, the ideology of a society basically justifies the material relations that exist in that society. So, capitalist society, Marx would not be surprised, comes up with a system of ideology, a superstructure that it throws up that legitimizes and allows people to think. And I've already been talking about how we come to think in capitalist ways. But we could look at some of the particular elements of capitalist ideology in our own society. For instance, Marx would identify a lot of the philosophy that we've been covering in our recent lectures as part of capitalist ideology. The idea of the self-made man and the person who succeeds by their own industry. Well, this is the kind of story that Marx would expect to be told in a capitalist society, because it's the kind of thing that you can tell to the laborers. Well, if you were only working harder, you wouldn't feel this alienation. You'd be able to join the bourgeoisie and move your way up in society. This, of course, is the basis of what we call the American dream, that story of poverty to riches, which if we tell over and over again in order to convince ourselves that this is possible, that every person, if they just put in the work, can in fact get themselves ahead. We individuals are all we need. Now, Marx, or the Marxist, has a job of kind of uncovering this, because they want to go and point out that actually this isn't the situation that you're in. So it doesn't take long searching to find that American society is actually remarkably not economically mobile, by which I mean it's not incredibly easy to move up from poverty to riches. Contemporary economic studies suggest that the chances of moving from the category of poverty to a high income category someplace between 4 and 11%. Not incredibly easy to do. Other economic studies have found that there's a kind of glass ceiling underneath the middle class that stops people from rising above it. This is kind of a mixture of intentional and unintentional. So if you have the money, what do you think about in terms of where you're going to get your house, right? I mean, lots of people look at the school system and they say, okay, so we want to buy our house where there's a good school system. Well, if people with more money go to places where there's good school systems, what does that leave people who don't have money, but particularly poor school systems, right? And the tendency of people in poverty to go to schools that are not as good reinforces the chances that as they grow up, they'll stay in poverty or won't be able to advance very much more. And as a matter of fact, over time, the chances of the society continually moving forward in terms of economic achievement have gotten worse and worse. So the chances that somebody who's born today will make more money than their parents has fallen significantly from what it was in the past. In the 1940s, 90% of people would make more money than their parents. In today's economy, the chances are right around or below 50%. And that's significant when you think about the fact that inflation is always going up. So in order to stay at the same place, you don't just need to make what your parents made, you really need to make more. So is the American dream just that? Just a dream? Well, the Marxist would suggest that it's a piece of ideology. Marx also focused on religion as a form of ideology, and so he focused particularly on Christianity, which he didn't have a very positive view of. He thought, oh, of course this is what religion would look like in a capitalist society. It tells the basic laborers, like, is Christianity in favor of violence or is it in favor of peace? Well, peace. And what are you supposed to do while you're here, except for that you're supposed to be a good person. You're supposed to go ahead, continue to work, continue to do those things. And even if you get screwed over by history, don't worry about it, because you will get your reward. When will you get it? When you die. So don't expect it before then. You have to accept the suffering that comes along with this world. At least that's what you're supposed to do now. And Marx said, this is a brilliant system of religion for propping up capitalism, because it tells people that you shouldn't create any trouble, don't rise above your own station, except be humble, right? And just go to work every day. And then eventually you're going to be rewarded, but not now. Nothing I'm going to give you, right? We'll just wait and God will take care of it eventually. So Marx sees Christianity as a form of ideology, something that's come about in order to justify the capitalist system. And the Marxist is all too happy to point out that often those who are preaching that everybody else should be humble and accept suffering and have less are in fact the ones that walk away with the cash. So, what's the solution to this problem? How can we resolve all of this internal angst and anxiety that grows out of my own alienation from labor and myself? How can I do something about that? Well, the trick is this. We've got to overcome the ideology first. We've got to develop what Marx calls class consciousness. And this means getting over a whole bunch of other things. People will have to reject the idea of the American dream, show that that doesn't actually work. And they'll have to get over things like racism, which Marx says is also a product of capitalism, because it keeps poor white people and poor black people fighting against each other instead of fighting against the true system that oppresses them all. What needs to happen is that you need to form an identity around the idea of being the proletariat, of being the working class. And you need to rise up at that point and say, we will no longer take this. Because you see, the big secret of capitalist society is that the people in power have no actual power. All that it would take to bring a capitalist society to its knees is for the working class to say, nope, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. Because they are the majority, and they're the ones that are fueling the entire system with their labor. So what it takes is for the members of the laboring class to refuse to do that any longer. And at the point that you actually got together and formed your own class identity, we would be prepared for the revolution. Oh shoot, I'm a white collar. I'm in a bad place. Revolution does hold off on the revolution. I can't. Just let me. Okay, here. I'm not a member of one of those bad classes. I'm blue collar. One of the people. Revolution. So Marx theorized that when people realized their own class consciousness, they would be able to gather together. Those laborers would be able to gather together really internationally, because he doesn't have in mind a picture for a national government or particular states. He wants the proletariat to rise up across the globe. Workers of the world unite. This is the way he saw it. And with very little trouble, he says, they'll be able to rise up and push off the shackles that the bourgeoisie have kept them in. After the revolution, he imagines that we'll be in a kind of chaotic period, because the structures of capitalist society will have been broken down and will need to reconstruct in order to socialize people, in order to get them into a new set of material relationships with people. And so there will be a time where there needs to be a dictatorship of the proletariat. This won't be the entire proletariat, because the entire proletariat is pretty broad. There are a whole bunch of people. So they'll select a particular set, a small group of the proletariat that'll take over. But how do we know at that point that the dictatorship of the proletariat won't just establish their own new feudal system, and they'll take over and they'll impose it upon everyone else, and then they'll just claim the power for themselves? Well, Marx says it's easy enough, because the people are produced by the particular economic system. And the proletariat are the best of people, because they're not the people who have been overtaken by greed as much as the bourgeoisie have. So the proletariat will be able to understand. They will be able to put in place a new system of material relations that will get rid of greed, allowing us to keep all of the advances of modern society, but setting aside those vicious tendencies which have dominated us through the periods of feudalism and capitalism. So what does that new system of material relations look like? Well, number one, the dictatorship of the proletariat will go about getting rid of private property. Eliminating private property is one of the first steps in bringing people back to a more natural state. You remember that our greed, our pride, our competitiveness were produced when the first person came across and said, "This is mine and not yours." So if we get rid of mine and not yours, then we'll get rid of greed and competitiveness, and everybody will be able to return to a more natural state where we'll be able to share with each other and not be so consumed by our own selfishness. So hippity-hoppity, abolish private property. That's not an actual thing. That's just a meme, the hippity-hoppity thing, and then they fixed it for Marxism. The dictatorship of the proletariat will also enculturate people with a new system of justice to give them the picture that they need to match with this propertyless society that we're developing. The new standard of justice is this: from each as he or she is able, to each as she or he has need. This returns to a kind of developed picture of what was happening naturally in that primitive communism, because everybody produces with their own abilities. They are invested in their own projects and their own productions. So there is no need to motivate these people with private property, right? Because they're not greedy anymore. They're motivated by their own creative forces, and they want to create. And so they'll do this. They'll let their creative forces out, and they'll create all of this stuff that the society needs. So production won't face a problem with the end of capitalism. It'll just return to a more natural state. And since we don't have private property and greed, we'll be free to share those goods with other people. And now we can have a much more adequate distribution of goods throughout the society. So note some of the absurdities that exist in our society. Like, for instance, at what point of life do you need money the most? Right? Well, it seems like it's when you're first getting out and trying to establish yourself, and you need a house, and you're maybe having babies and like paying off your college debt and all of this stuff. All of a sudden you have all of these bills coming due. And in our society, when do we pay people the least? Well, it's just when they're starting and they're trying to get themselves established and they're starting a family. And why the heck do we have a system that does that? Isn't that remarkably inefficient? Like, imagine like towards the end of your life when your kids have gone off to college and you're living by yourself at your house and you've downsized to a smaller house because you didn't really need the room that you had your kids for. Then you don't need as much money. And at what point do we pay you the most? It's there at the end of your life when doesn't seem like a good way to set things up, right? Well, the Marxists would say no. As a matter of fact, what we should do is we should organize an economy that gives to people in accord to their need. And it says, so in some sense, going along with Aristotle's picture of equality of proportion, we could say that the Marxist economy attempts to provide to people what's due in the light of their need. So, contrary to popular opinion, Marxists are not for an absolute, like, numeric equality. That's not Marxism. It is, in fact, a picture that tries to figure out when people have different needs and tries to fulfill those as much as is possible. And according to the Marxist system, you shouldn't have a problem gaining productions in order to share with those people when they're in need, because everybody would be producing in accord with their own creativity. So at this point, we could move into a system of communism, or communist utopia even. I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate, but Marx doesn't entirely fill out what the system is supposed to look like on the far side of the revolution. Like most of those figures who are fighting against the aristocracy, he's more worried about ripping down what's come before than he is about articulating exactly what things are supposed to look like afterwards. But definitely there are some elements to this. He does not believe that the dictatorship of the proletariat will be permanent. He imagines that, like any other form of government, has to do with enforcing people into a particular mode of production. But this long-term is not actually what Marxism aims at. Hopefully, the dictatorship of the proletariat would eventually become unnecessary, because people would have accepted this new system of justice and been shaped by the new system of material relations so that they don't need any further enforcement. And once you were there, well, I mean, you might need something to like coordinate these exchanges of goods, but that wouldn't be, in Marx's sense, a government, because it wouldn't be forcing people into anything. As a matter of fact, the government would simply be an expression of the will of the people. Perhaps even a democratic society. I mean, that fits with Marx's general picture, where people would want to participate and want to get involved in all of these things. But Marx doesn't consider that a government, because really it's just an expression of what the people want. And some have taken Marxism actually in the direction of anarchy, the elimination of all government, and the belief that we should just exist as individuals at that point, once we've given up on private property, and that we will have inherent systems of justice that just run on their own as we naturally function. So we find at the end of Marx's system another picture which lines up with an extremely liberal picture. As a matter of fact, if this is right, Marx's ultimate picture might have been somewhat libertarian, getting rid of the government, not even having a small government, going beyond that into anarchy. So let's put Marx in contact with the themes for our course. Human nature. Humans are expressive beings, meant to live life expressing themselves through the product of their labor and making their own life plans. It sounds nice. Kind of a mixture between, as I said, the Aristotelian picture of the self that wants to be participative in lots of different activities, and the Lockean picture of the self as an individual. Social or individual? Again, here we find a kind of mixed bag. Human beings are individuals, but they fit together in a just society. There, the capacities of one match the needs of another. So the individual and the society are always in relationship with one another. We don't have to give up ultimately. We don't have to choose between being social or being individual. Because ultimately, if we could just achieve the just Marxist society, we could have our cake and eat it too. People and property. Private property is a contingent institution that gives rise to greed in human beings. It should be abolished. Get rid of it. Equality or inequality? Well, humans are originally equal in primitive communism. Human beings are equal not when they are equal in negative natural rights. It doesn't mean that I just have an equal set of rights that separate me from you, but when they're in communities of direct exchange between capacity and need, when I'm producing things that you need, when you're producing things that I need, and we allow that flow to happen without the complications of private property, which gives rise to greed. The shape of government. Government is not natural, but it's created in order to protect unjust material relations. Now, that doesn't mean that he entirely gets rid of any structures for sociality. In the communist utopia, or in communism, past the dictatorship of the proletariat, he might be open to a kind of overstructure that coordinates exchange of capacity and need, or he might be in favor of some kind of democracy, but he doesn't consider that to be really a government anymore, because it's an expression of the will of the people. And maybe he even goes so far as to prefer a kind of anarchy eventually. The purpose of government, well, properly, government exists to protect injustice. But communism will enable exchange of capacity and need and allow people to live fulfilling lives of expression. What authorizes leadership? Here I'm going to break down a little bit because I think it depends on which period of history you live in. And I'm going to focus on the ones that we focused on in this lecture. So under capitalism, the leader would be one who facilitates the rise to class consciousness and leads people to rebellion. Second, in the dictatorship of the proletariat, representing the proletariat, socializing the community away from public property and into communist accounts of justice. And three, in communism, or in communist utopia, the government, the leader, would be the embodiment of the true will of the classless society, the propertyless society. Or maybe there just wouldn't be any need for a leader anymore, because once we've gotten rid of the injustice of society, we no longer need to force people to do things. Okay, so let me close with a few general words on Marx and Marxism, because I know that Marx and Marxism are, again, contentious terms in our society. So I don't think that Marx's philosophy anybody should buy off on in whole any more than I think that anybody should buy off on any other particular philosophy in our course. And I'll point out some of the things that I think are problematic. So I don't, in fact, agree with Marx that property and private property is the source of our own greed. And as a matter of fact, I think that was one of the problems that came about as people tried to implement Marxism, was that they thought that property was the only source of our greed and lust for power. And so in, say, Russia, when they got rid of property, they thought, okay, this will get rid of greed and their desire for power. But it turned out that power is its own thing, and you can be greedy for power just as much as you are for property. So I think that greed is more embedded in us than Marx tended to think. This then leads to the problem on the other side, that I think Marx was a little bit utopian in thinking that bringing down the system of capitalism would in fact lead to a system where we could eventually get past maybe government and get past oppression and get past all of these problems. And so Marxism became, throughout a lot of the 20th century, a very problematic philosophy. But we ought also to say that none of the actual applications of Marxism fit with exactly what Marx wanted, right? I mean, it's not like Stalin, who ended up running Russia through most of the period of its communism, was actually a Marxist. I mean, he did not want to dissolve his dictatorship. He didn't aim at that at any point. And he was one of the most oppressive leaders of all time. The guy was a mass murderer. But that's not what Marx envisioned. And Marx accepted that there was going to be legitimate violence, and he thought that that should come with the revolution, but it should be a part of bringing about a new society that eventually breaks with that. And the Soviet regime never actually came to that. I think we also ought to say that Marx's social analysis of capitalism is actually remarkably helpful, because Marx does go beyond those liberal theorists in going into ways that human beings are coerced by institutions other than the government, so that a simple form of liberalism that focuses only on the danger of authoritarianism in the government runs the risk of ignoring the ways that economic systems can end up oppressing people as well. And from this, we can continue to develop out to account for other systems that in fact oppress people. So not just economic, but as we saw with Wollstonecraft, systems of patriarchy, and as we saw with Douglas, systems of racism. And this brings us to an account of a whole set of systems might be oppressing us. And we'll see that, we'll come back to that when we come to the last readings that we have for class as we move out of the modern and into a little bit of the postmodern. So we'll get back to that, as I say. But for right now, we're going to go into some other discussions of distribution with some people who neither agree with Marx nor Bentham, and have some disagreements with Locke as well. But we'll return first to a modern expression of the liberal tradition, which tries to make some reforms. I'll see you next time.